Hello, my dear friends. I hope everyone had a beautiful Yontif. In the Mitzvah Hashem, the Rebbeinu Hashem should accept all our tefillos, our prayers. He should grant to us a year of shalom, of peace, and happiness, health, nachas, parnasa for ourselves and for all of Klal Yisrael. Today I want to speak about my grandfather who passed away 52 years ago, Chal Moed Sukkot. So his yahrzeit is about a week away. Excuse me. My grandfather had a very profound impact on me. And even though it's 52 years, it's more than half a century since he's no longer alive, but my grandfather continues to have an effect on who I am. My grandfather was born in a city called Visheva, which is in Romania. He was in the city was called Mittel Visheva in 1881. His name was Nachman Zadie ben Yaakov David. Yaakov David was my great-grandfather. I am named Yaakov David after my great-grandfather. This is my maternal grandfather, my mother's father. He was born in 1881, and when he passed away in 1969, he was approximately 88 years old. He lived in Visheva until he was 29 years old. My grandfather's family were Hasidim. The Visheva Rabbi, the Rabbi in Vishev, was a brother to the Vishnitzer Rebbe, so they were connected to the Vishnitzer dynasty. And my grandfather's last name was Bash. The Bash family were Vishnitzer Hasidim. When my father came to America in 1911, he was 29 years old. He wanted to bring his wife to America because life in Europe was extremely hard, but he couldn't afford a ticket for himself and his wife. He came first himself. He worked in the sweatshops for 2 years, and then he was able to purchase a ticket for my grandmother. It turned out that my grandmother was pregnant. He didn't know when he left. She was pregnant with a child. She was born in my grandfather's absence. So my grandfather he bought a ticket for my grandmother and her young baby, my aunt, that they should come to America, which they did in 2 years later, in 1911. My grandfather, what was really special about him was you could count on your fingers the amount of people that came to America at the turn of the 20th century, and they held on to their Yiddishkeit. And my grandfather was an extremely religious person. He had profound religious feelings. He remained a chassid his whole life, even though he didn't have the external trappings of a chassid, but he always felt he was a Vishnitzer chassid. In fact, at my bar mitzvah, this is sort of like a humorous story, that my grandfather decided, my grandfather wore a gartel. He didn't wear a shtreimel, but he wore a gartel when he davened. He decided I should have a gartel. So at the bar mitzvah Shabbos afternoon, after the Suda was over, my grandfather, I remember sitting in the kitchen, I was 13 years old, of course. My grandfather comes in with a gartel, and he says, "Here, Yaiki, this is a gartel for you. I want you to be able to wear this gartel." Now, my father comes from a Litvish family. My father did not wear gartels. I said to my grandfather, "Zadie, I can't wear a gartel. It's not my family's minhag." He says, "What do you mean? It's so important to wear a gartel?" And I remember we had he was not happy. I can tell you that. He tried to convince me to wear a gartel, and I think he was disappointed that I didn't wear a gartel. I'm mentioning that as, aside from the human interest, but to show you that he was a committed Jew. He was always Shomer Shabbos, and he raised his children to be Shomer Shabbos Jews, and his children and grandchildren, many children and grandchildren who, Baruch Hashem, are Shomer Shabbos. But my grandfather, my grandfather had a tremendous feeling for Torah study, and my grandfather would study every day Ein Yaakov. Ein Yaakov is a collection of the Agadic literature that's found throughout the Talmud, and my grandfather every day went to an Ein Yaakov shir, and he mastered the Ein Yaakov. He knew it backwards and forwards. And my father told me that whenever he had to find a Gemara, and he didn't remember Agada, he didn't know where it was, he would call up my grandfather, and my grandfather would share that with my father. So he was involved constantly in Torah study. My grandfather davened in the Chassidish shtibel in Borough Park, which is where he lived towards the end of his life. or even in the middle years of his life. And I believe the rabbi, the shul, was a Rabbi Parnas, Chassidish Rebbe. My grandmother, Ola Hashem, used to bake challahs for Rabbi Parnas. That's how committed they were to Rabbi Parnas. And that's where my grandfather davened. I remember davening there with my grandfather in 1956. My father was hired to be the rabbi of the Young Israel Forest Hills. We previously had been in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and in Rosh Hashanah time, the shul wanted him to be in Forest Hills, but he didn't have a house yet, so my mother didn't have a place to stay, so my mother, together with the three of us, myself and my two siblings, stayed with my grandparents and over Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So I remember going to shul with my grandfather on Yom Kippur, sitting next to him, and he sat in the shul the entire davening. It's a precious memory that I have, sitting next to my Zadie, who was a person, like I say, had very profound religious feelings, and just that memory it continues to inspire me. So I was thinking about how was it that my grandfather managed to stay so religiously committed throughout his lifetime. He was in America at a time when if you were Shomer Shabbos, you would work until Friday, and then they would fire you, and you'd have to look for a new job after Shabbos. But nonetheless, he remained steadfast, and it wasn't just that he was meticulous, but he was totally committed. I remember when my grandfather passed away in 1969. So it was Chal Moed, and normally in Chal Moed you're not supposed to say a eulogy. Most people, what they do is they want to be able to eulogize the person who passes away, so they'll say, "I'm not saying a hesped." A hesped is something that evokes pain and crying and things like that. I'm just going to say divrei shvach. I'm going to praise the nifter. I'm going to say words of praise. My father wouldn't have it. My father officiated at the Levaya, and my father stood up, and my father said, my shver lived his whole life according to Shulchan Aruch, and I know that he would want in his passing that we should also follow meticulously the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch says there's no hespedim, so there's no hespedim. That was both a reflection on my father, on his integrity and his strength of character, but it was also a reflection on my grandfather, that my father knew that my grandfather would not want hespedim. On Chomai, Shulchan Aruch says you're not supposed to have hespedim. My grandfather had tremendous derech eretz for Rabbanim and for Torah. He did not call my father by his first name. He would call Rabbi Luban. It was his son-in-law. It was his Adam. But he always referred to him as Rabbi Luban. And as I grew up as a teenager, my grandfather was so proud that I was becoming a Ben Torah as well. And one summer we were in a bungalow colony, and a lot of young kids, and they asked me, I was about 17, they asked me to say a shir, teach the kids Gemara. Now, in a bungalow colony, none of the kids wanted to learn Gemara, and I had absolutely no experience in teaching whatsoever. So my shir was like a pandemonium. It was, the kids were running around and jumping off the rafters and things like that. But my grandfather, he spent the summer with us. He insisted that he has to be at the shir. His grandson is saying a shir. He wanted to, it was some shir. But he wanted to be there for the shir, and he sat there from beginning to end, and I was almost like embarrassed that my grandfather should be sitting there and listening to me try to say shir to kids that are so unruly and they're not paying any attention. Didn't make a difference to my grandfather. His grandson was on the way to becoming a Ben Torah. He wanted to be present to give the shir. So what's remarkable is that throughout his lifetime, that flavor, the European flavor, which we can't duplicate that in America, the very profound feelings, the sense of closeness to the Ribono Shalom, the love of fulfilling the mitzvos. My grandfather had that throughout his lifetime, and I'm reminded of a Rashi in this week's parsha. Rashi quotes a Sifri, and the Sifri says on the pasuk of the opening of the parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu addresses Klal Yisrael, and he says, "My words will be kesirim alidesha v'chivivim al yesav." That means like rain will be on the grass and the foliage. So the Medrash says, why does Moshe compare his words to rain? So the Medrash says, "Masi'irim halolu yordam al asavim uma'alan osam." Just like the rain, it falls on the blades of grass, and it lifts them up, umagadan osam, and it elevates them. It causes them to grow. Kach divrei Torah, the same way divrei Torah, ma'alim lomdehem. It elevates those that study Torah, umagadan osam. It inspires them to become great, as the pasuk says in Mishlei Salsala. Is the proper pronunciation Salsala? I wrote it down. No, Salsaleha. You should caress it with usaromemecha, and it will elevate you. When you embrace Torah, it elevates you. And what you see from here is that the nature of Torah is that it promotes spiritual growth. It's not just an intellectual exercise. Torah transforms the person, who I talk about all the time. You see this happening before your eyes. Our young people, we have outstanding young men and women in our community. Are just tremendous. They have super fine midos, and they go to Eretz Yisrael, and as fine as they are before they leave, when they come back, you can't recognize them. They have a different look, what we call a different surah, because they have become inspired. And what inspires them? They go to Eretz Yisrael, they sit and learn in a yeshiva or in a seminary, and the Torah elevates them, like the Medrash says. The Torah is megadol them, and it promotes religious growth in them, and that's what has the impact on them, and that's what it was with my grandfather. It was the Torah that he studied elevated him and made him into a person with such strong religious feeling and commitment. My grandfather used to quote a Gemara in Psachim. The Gemara says that Rav Yossi, when it came Shavuos, he made a special Suda, and he said, "Ilav hayoma kama Yosef ikab shuka." If not for this day of Shavuos, there will be plenty of other people in the marketplace with the name Yosef. I wouldn't be special. Torah made me into who I am. And my grandfather would paraphrase it, and he would say, "Ilav hayoma kama Nachman ika de kagarim." If not for this day of Shavuos that had an impact on me, kama Nachman ika b'shuka. There will be scores of Nachmans. His name was Nachman. There would be scores of Nachman. As the Gemara says, Yosef, it was Rav Yosef said it, but my grandfather paraphrased it. Kama Nachman ika b'shuka. Look how many Nachmans there would be. In other words, he recognized that it was the Torah that he studied that transformed him and made him who he was, and gave him he came to America with religious feeling that he absorbed in Vishava, growing up in the Hasidic community in pre-war Europe. But to be able to maintain that in America, and he was the same way when he got off the boat. He stayed the same way until the day that he passed away in 1969. That was because the Torah infused in him the religious feeling and the sincerity and the integrity and the warmth and the relationship for HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the love of mitzvos. It was the Torah, like the Medrash says, like the Sifri says, the Torah, just like the water, the rain causes the grass to grow, Torah causes an individual to grow. And it's a powerful lesson that Torah has to have an impact on a person. You can't just learn Torah. If it doesn't do anything to you, then it means that you're not learning it the right way. You're not appreciating it. Torah has an enormous impact on the individual, and it transforms the individual. And my grandfather, because Ein Yaakov in particular is the Agadic elements of Shas, is full of Yerushalayim and Hashkafa, and that's what had that impact on my grandfather. And he recognized that by saying, "Ilav hayom de kagarim kama Nachman ika b'shuka." If not for Torah, would not be anything special. So my grandfather, Mirz Hashem, he should have an Aliyas Neshama on his yard site, which is Chaf Tishrei, so it's in about 7-8 days. And in Mirz Hashem, we should all be inspired. We all have special parents and special grandparents. We should be inspired by their example. And in this period of time of the Yom Ra'im and the Yantif of Sukkot, we should continue to grow and move closer to the Rebbeinu Shalom.